Good morning and welcome to Hacking HR's June series. Today we're going to be talking about understanding the basics, how to create durable and amazing employee experience at work. Nope, we are not. As I was reading it, I knew I was wrong. My apologies. We are talking about connecting the dots, understanding the connection between employee experience and people and business success. That's the one I studied for. Welcome in. I'm Lauren Lefkowitz. I'm your host and moderator. I'm an executive coach and HR. My goodness, once you get off topic, right? I am an executive coach and a fractional HR professional. And I have 20 years of HR corporate experience. So I'm super happy to be here with you today and really excited to welcome our panelists in who hopefully will be forgiving about my introduction. Welcome on in, panelists. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I would love to just come around the room and have you introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, what you do, what your experience in HR is, and why this topic resonates with you. And let's start with Meredith.
Hey, thank you, Lauren. And you're doing great, by the way. I loved that tone setting. So I'm Meredith Fujita, and I am dialing in from Princeton, New Jersey. I have about 15 years of HR leadership experience. I am currently consulting. My most recent in-house role was for a B2B SaaS platform around business intelligence called CB Insights. And the reason why this resonates with me is I have a very strong conviction around employee experience driving business results. We all get into HR largely to make positive impacts on people's work experience. That's very important to us, and it's very important to our stakeholders to prove that that connects to business results. So I've had a lot of challenges around that in my career and happy to talk about it today.
Amazing. Thank you. Heather, let's move to you next.
Awesome. Nice to see everybody. I've been in HR for about 17 years, in a leadership role for about 12. Always worked in technology, really fast-moving, agile organizations. And similar to what Meredith said, I think that employee experience connection is at the core of what we do and really drives business success and results. And I think that's where sometimes organizations can miss the mark, that employee experience and the emotional side and the feeling actually is directly linked to the success of the business and the data and the numbers. So really excited to have this conversation.
Thank you. And Charmaine.
Hi, everyone. I am Charmaine, the founder and CEO of Chapter 2 LLC, which is an organizational leadership and people development consultancy. And I'm excited to be here. As it was just said, there's definitely a direct link between employee experience and what I'll call customer experience, because let's be honest, every business has customers because they have clients. So I'm excited to get talking about this because so much research has been done behind this.
Thank you. And Malvika.
Hi, everyone. I'm Malvika. I'm the co-founder of Atvis Group, which is a human capital advisory firm born from the core belief that to win in the marketplace, you have to win in the workplace. And that is exactly why I'm excited about this topic today. It's very important and core to everything that we do here at Atvis Group. And I'm dialing in from Chicago, and I've spent pretty much the entirety of my career in HR. Did some finance and accounting work in the beginning of my career, so I bring a very analytical and data-oriented bent to everything that I do from a people perspective.
Thank you. And Chris.
Hi, everyone. I'm dialing in from Hampshire in the United Kingdom. So I've got a slightly different background. I spent the first half of my career in the military as an army officer, but did quite a lot of operational work, resourcing work, planning, and so on. But then at the same time did an HR master's and an MBA and moved more into leadership development and then talent management. And then once I left, I spent some time in strategy houses or consulting, the likes of Korn Ferry, Capgemini, places like that. And now I'm in HR leadership roles, have been for a little while. Current role is to be the global head of strategic workforce planning for a company called Babcock International. Its main remit is an engineering firm, but it does a lot more than that, and it supports things like the servicing of submarines, the construction of frigates for navies. It also does communications work and more. So back in defense.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for introducing yourselves. We have clearly a very powerful group of people here today. So what I'd like to do with all of you panelists is just pay attention to when your co-panelists unmute, and we'll give everybody an opportunity to respond to every question. Feel free to say nothing to add if you have nothing to add, but I'd love to hear all of the different perspectives. So let's just start by doing a little bit of defining what we're talking about. So we're talking about the connection between the employee experience and people in business success. What does that mean? What does that mean to you as a business leader? What does it mean to you to connect the dots between the experience and success?
So I'm happy to make a stab at that. For me, there's almost no point doing something unless you can drive value from it. And a lot of business leaders used to come to HR professionals because they just needed something done. And a lot of bad, busy work was seen. And in my experience, I've also looked quite closely at performance management processes and redesigned talent strategies and recruitment processes and things like that. And always at the heart of it, we realized that in order to get more value from it for both the person and for the business, we needed to be really clear on how we integrated comms and engagement to enhance employee or candidate experience at the heart of what it was that we were doing. Otherwise, we lost all of the performance benefits or the value add from it. And so for me, that plays through in all sorts of areas of HR, but also business leaders having to think about this too, line managers at every level, because without that, you lose so much. And in my world at the moment, which is evidence-based HR and data, we're able to then put the evidence case behind, well, this is why people are leaving, and they're leaving from this area or for these reasons. And so there is an ability to get after this and to enhance employee experiences and to see the benefits from it, or where it's not happening, where the disbenefits lie.
I can jump in next. I love that. I think a few people already have mentioned data and analytics. I think that's really at the backbone of everything we do and how we prove those business cases. And I think us as HR leaders, we in some ways have a difficult job. On one side of the coin, we deeply care about people. We care about their experience and their happiness. But then we also have to show from a business perspective how that side of the coin is actually going to add that value and drive the revenue, and leaning on that data, both from a benchmarking and a starting point perspective, but then also, like Chris said, you see a lot of really interesting trends come through, whether it be turnover or career path gaps or training issues, engagement issues, things like that come through. And I think that's really where we both find the data and the direction that we need to start going in, but then also prove to the organization why this is crucial and why this is going to impact the bottom line.
I think Heather and Chris hit the nail on the head. You know, what I would add is what I've seen in my experiences. Unfortunately, when it comes to employee experience, some leaders, or a lot of leaders in some organizations, have the notion that this is really an HR thing. You know, HR should manage employee experience. That's not my, you know, I'm the head of marketing, or I manage the finance department, right? And they kind of almost think of employee experience as an occupational hazard in their job. And so when we talk about connecting the dots between employee experience and people and business success, it's really about first helping our leaders understand that 70% of an employee's engagement is influenced by their direct manager, not by HR, right? We are not the ones working with them day in and day out and impacting their employee experience. And therefore, the business outcomes and the results that they drive are going to be directly influenced by their interactions with their manager and their team. And that is really what we should be focusing on improving.
Malvika, I think you said it right. It's like the employee experience is the product of the HR team, right? And the way that we measure the success of our products, traditionally might be sentiment. It might be turnover rates. It can be anecdotal things that we're hearing from employees. But when you talk to that marketing leader, for instance, and you're able to tie, like really, really clearly correlate that experience with their objectives, their OKRs, their KPIs. Like, here's what was happening with the experience when those results were suffering, and here's what was happening with the experience when you were succeeding. So being able to bring not only the traditional HR metrics, but the business metrics into those conversations is really helpful.
I'd echo that as well. When I really think about it, everyone that works for the company is an employee. So one of the things I also like to remind people, whether it's marketing or anyone else, is what is the experience that you're having and what's the experience that you want to create? There's enough stats out there that show there is a direct connection between employee experience, their engagement, and the business profitability. And I think it was last year something, I read a Harvard Business Review article that said that companies that invest in their employee experience and their customer experience are able to charge like 16% more for their products and services. So, meaning people are still going to pay for it if they have a great experience. So you can charge more and people are willing to pay more. And even think about my life. There are some companies and brands that we could all relate to that we love, that yes, there's cheaper options available, but there's a connection that we have to that brand. And because of that, and if we can think of it in that way, we can certainly tie it back to the actual employee experience within the organization, because ultimately we are all customers and consumers in an aspect of our lives, several.
Thank you for bringing that up, Charmaine, and thanks everyone for bringing in your connections with this. When we talk about, I wasn't actually going to start with ROI, but Charmaine, I think you gave us such a good lead in. So before we talk about tactics and processes, and Charmaine, if you want to start us off by adding to this, what is the ROI that you've seen in companies you've worked in or with when we have paid attention to the employee experience and prioritized it as a business essential?
Yeah, absolutely. Higher engagement scores, higher innovation, higher productivity, higher, customer satisfaction, and ultimately higher profits, right? And the thing about it, especially, and I get that every company doesn't do this, right? So we're also speaking from a place of privilege if we work for a company that can afford bonuses and those things, but it's directly, tangibly tied. So when employees are feeling good and they recognize, wait a minute, my efforts in an environment that I feel good in, right? Because no one's gonna show up with sunshine and flowers when they feel crappy somewhere. It's directly tied to the bonus that I can receive. So it's directly tied to my personal, financial wealth. That's huge because I can tangibly connect an input of committed to the experience and what that process leads to in terms of innovation and engagement to not only business profitability, but in turn now what the employees are able to receive, right? So, we can do larger bonuses. We can maybe give you more of a merit percent increase. We can create more opportunities for you. Maybe we can pay for a conference. We can pay for, return to some type of educational learning, whatever that is. There's a direct connection. And I think the piece sometimes that organizations don't get right is being able to draw that connection for people, right? Sometimes there's an assumption that people automatically get that, or where I've seen it work really well is when I've worked with organizations that not only committed to that, but actually helped paint that picture for other people so that they got it. And that really made the difference too, because helping to paint the picture for them and communication is also part of the employee experience. So that's my ROI that I'm seeing.
Who else?
Charmaine, thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear you talk about the ROI for the employee as well as for the company. And I think that comes out in really clear communication. It's just as important to tie the success or the employee experience, the quality of the employee experience to business success, not only for the organization, but for the employees. Employees, what is an employee experience, right? I think it's important to define that first. What is it that your employees want? Obviously they want to be compensated, competitively. They want to be able to build their skill set and develop a career at the organization. So what is it about, the correlation between those things and overall business success that excites both sides of the conversation? I think that's really important. So thanks for highlighting that.
I can jump in next. Yeah, completely agree. And I think when it comes to ROE, the obvious is revenue, customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, things like that. But I think there's also a huge intangible when it comes to ROE that sometimes companies don't quantify or acknowledge, which is when employees have a good experience, they're more engaged, they're more likely to solve problems, they're more likely to take on a little bit more, come up with ideas, fix things that are broken. And I say to my team, especially in the market that we're in, it's a little kind of at a bit of a standstill when it comes to employees moving around. My biggest fear isn't a high turnover rate. It's people wanting to leave and disengaging and not leaving the organization. That to me gives me more fear and worry. And the market kind of supports that model. So how do we get all of those people to be engaged and really committed and dedicated and find that value internally?
I think that's spot on, Heather. I, like you, worry not as much about people leaving, but staying and becoming disengaged. That is so dangerous to culture. And if you think about the negative impacts of a bad employee experience, obviously turnover or retention issues come to mind. I think we all know when someone leaves, especially when it's an unplanned departure, it can cost the company anywhere between 1x to 2x. Some sources will even tell you up to 4x their annual compensation to hire and onboard and replace that person. And I was part of a different webinar yesterday where they shared a study where they looked at, would people prioritize compensation over culture? Because again, when you talk to business leaders, often they jump to using compensation as a tool to reward and engage and motivate people, right? And this study demonstrated, I think, what we all know in the HR world, which is it showed that 72% of employees would prioritize culture over compensation. And the question wasn't just, what would you do if you received an increase in compensation? It was, what would you do if you received a 30% increase in your annual compensation? And still 72% of people said they would prioritize culture every day over that 30% jump in compensation.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That my point builds on that, but also particular what you were saying, Heather. When I worked as a consultant, we did quite a lot of work to map the benefits of discretionary effort. So it's the extra effort that people will go in, that extra mile, because they are motivated, because of the employee experience that they're experiencing at work. And throughout my career, I've actually been somebody who's had negative and positive experiences as myself as an employee. I guess most of us would have, but they've really kind of stuck with me when the employee experience was something which really made me want to move my job. And I know how I felt and how disengaged I was, and how I was able to, on the converse side, really perform. And even in military context, where you're seeing people really go above and beyond and perform in that context as well, because you've managed to get all of the intrinsic factors right. And it also reminded me of a piece of work I did for a reward director who was wanting to place a lot of money on the benefits package for people, more flexibility, more choice. But actually, when we engaged more broadly across the organization, we realized that the biggest return on investment was going to be not just on the extrinsic, but really doubling down on the intrinsic factors that really would take away some of the pain points around line manager issues that were pervasive there, which was affecting employee experience. But also, how do you then create a vibe, a real positive experience at work? And we were then able to implement that strategy, and the turnaround and the impacts onto culture were what, we didn't measure it in quite the same way. But Malvika, what you're saying about 2 times, 4 times, and so on, wouldn't surprise me at all. And just from my own personal experiences, I think it's, we know how much better we perform when the intrinsic factors are all in place, and when you end up working for a really great manager or leader.
Thank you, everyone. We have a comment from someone in our audience, and if you're listening and following along with us today, if you have questions that come up, please put them in the comments, because we're paying attention to those, and we'll bring those into the conversation as we can. But this person said, I completely agree. Compensation is only one factor of total rewards that makes employees return to work each day, whereas culture is what will make employees go above and beyond. Employees want to feel valued, appreciated, and psychologically safe. Compensation alone will not provide those intrinsic rewards. And we see that, right? There's a certain compensation point where we need to feel comfortable that we're paying fairly and well and competitively. And then anything above and beyond that is nice. And like, we're not going to say no to it. But the more important factor becomes, okay, I can live on this money. I feel good about making this money. Make me feel good about coming to work. So let's start with, I think, the most obvious measure that our leadership tends to think about. Let's do an engagement survey. So let's talk about what the benefits of an engagement survey are, and then my next question after that. So let's stick with benefits, but then let's talk next about the risk of an engagement survey.
Yeah. I'm happy to start. I think we all agree there's so many benefits. And before even conducting the survey, you have to define, what does engagement mean? I don't think it's enough to say, are you engaged on a scale of 1 to 5? You need to dig deeper and ask some more probing questions. I think, like many things, especially within HR, you really have to take those survey results and data points with a grain of salt, and you have to integrate it with other pieces of information that are coming through the organization and other methods. It can't be a standalone data point. I think one of the risks is, we all know we're never, or it's very unlikely to get 100% response rate. So those people that aren't responding, sometimes they're incredibly disengaged, and those are the folks you really need to hear from. So 10, 15, 20% of those people can really impact and skew the results. So I think that's a big consideration. And then, of course, how valid, how honest the feedback is. That's always going to be the question from employees. So again, that kind of comes back to the taking that data with a grain of salt. And then how do you measure that over time? Probably through benchmarking and seeing trends throughout the organization, either seasonally or when other things happen within the company, what impacts those engagement scores.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Sorry, Malvika, I didn't see you wanted to talk there, but yeah, in my experience, I've seen people jump to talking to engagement surveys as soon as we start talking about employee experience. And for me, I've seen it where you get lower levels of engagement because, oh my gosh, it's another survey, right? And actually, you don't necessarily get engagement very often you don't get engagement just because you've engaged with the organization. And what I mean by that is obviously the definition of engagement around how do you get people to be more or to perform better with higher levels of discretionary effort and energy. So I've seen a number of engagements, obviously important here. I've worked with a number of tech suppliers who have near real-time or real-time engagement capabilities. And I think a blended approach to this, which is both data-driven, but also those intrinsic leadership-based ways of working, needs to all come together to help us understand what actually is the experience like, and to what extent are we providing people with voice and choice, and how are we doing change? How are we engaging with people as we go about changing things that are going to affect people's time at work? So surveys have their place, but I think it's that whole system of listening that needs to play its part.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, it is part of a system or a listening strategy, that those survey results. And the nice thing about surveys is that you can, those points can be tracked over time. You can establish a baseline because it's numerical scores. You can kind of see what's moving over time. I think it's really, really important for the people team to have a strong point of view on the place that the engagement survey results plays, like the role that those results play in the overall strategy. And I think a risk, that I'm sure we've probably all experienced is the highly interpretive nature of some of those results. And without having a strong point of view, when you go to your executive stakeholders, they begin to interpret those results for themselves. And going in prepared with very strong analytics. This is what's happened over time. This is what else was happening. Here are the business results and the way that they were trending in a correlative manner. Having all of that ready, right, is really important for mitigating that risk of the interpretive nature of that.
Yeah. I love that you talked about that piece too, because the interpretation piece is definitely where I've seen a lot go downhill. In terms of benefits, I do think that being able to show that there's a level of commitment to at least seek in, the perspective of the employees, I think that's a positive, outcome of even conducting the surveys. I also think that, people feeling like they have an opportunity, or at least believing that they have an opportunity to be heard, also creates some, I'm going to call it good juju, right? Like that's what I think. However, I do think that the biases and misinterpretation sometimes overshadow that. And the other piece is the analysis paralysis that happens, because from the results of the survey to action, or even before we get to action, the communication of the results to employees, that window I've seen be so long that employees are like, what are we talking about right now? So I think the opportunity there really is, how do you connect your desire and the process of collecting the feedback, right? Because it can help you make more informed, decisions, right? Data-driven decision-making, to the communication and the actually execution of that. Because if you tell me today, oh, I'm just making this up, you told me that you need me to give you a bottle of water every morning, and it takes you a year to start doing that, you've lost a year. And I think the big opportunity and the big risk often that impacts so much is not only the analysis paralysis, but the delay in communicating anything. And all organizations, in my mind, have an opportunity to do much better there.
Couldn't agree more, Charmaine. One thing I'm observing, and I'd be curious to know if others are seeing and observing as well, is from my conversations, I feel like there's a trust gap and sort of an unsettled employer-employee relationship right now. Especially post-pandemic, you have employers kind of pushing people to come back to the office. 2023 was declared as the year of productivity by Meta and other companies. And then we went through this cycle of constant layoffs. And so employers are sending the message, we don't trust you. We need you to be right in front of our eyes and under our noses for us to make sure that you are working and doing your job well. And then on the other hand, employees are saying, we don't trust management. There was another survey done recently that showed only a third of people trust the leadership in their company. And more than half of the employees in the survey said that they would trust a stranger on the street before they would trust the management in their company. That is quite alarming to me. And so when we think about engagement surveys, if you have a trust gap, or if you have kind of an unsettled, management and employee relationship, I think an engagement survey can play a role there to some extent, especially because, they tend to be anonymous. So you can gather feedback in an anonymous setting and kind of create a safe space to gather the voice of the employee. It can also tell you where some of the issues lie. I really believe in the Pareto principle. Often 80% of the actions drive, or 20% of the actions drive 80% of the results. So it can tell you, there's a problem in your Asia region, or there's a problem in your legal department, or what have you. But the risks, again, are, as Charmaine very eloquently noted, analysis paralysis, which then leads to inaction. The worst thing that you can do is do an engagement survey and then not do anything about it. I'd rather you don't do an engagement survey at that point at all. That's actually better. And then the other thing is, just relying on engagement surveys alone. You have to complement them or supplement them with exit interview data, stay interview data, focus groups, one-on-one conversations, especially with your high-performing, high-potential employees who you really, really want to retain. And then look at the holistic picture of what is the employee voice telling us.
Such amazing insights, and thank you for weaving in the risks of not following up on an engagement survey and having those disengaged employees not respond, so you're not getting their input. When you think about, let's imagine that you've been pulled into a company, or in your company that you're working in now, that you've done an engagement survey. How do you get leadership engaged in deciding what's next? Because I think there's a tendency for, one of you said it earlier, I think Malvika, I think it was you, that people say like, oh, that's an HR thing. Let HR handle that. But an engagement survey, while distributed by HR and while strategized by HR, requires the input and really engagement of the whole leadership team. So how do you come back from getting the results of an engagement survey? Like, what do you do next? What are your steps?
I think it starts way before the results, right? You don't start deciding how to engage leadership once you have results. My teams and I have learned to bring leadership in from the very beginning. Engagement surveys are an initiative. They're a project, even though we run them cyclically. Each one is run in a different climate, different environment. And so bringing leadership in for a conversation about the hypotheses, the objectives, the things that we're looking to validate, the things that we're looking to debunk potentially, bring them in from the very beginning. And have that conversation also about how those results might tie to business results. What is it that's going on in the business that we think might be impacted by the experience, and how is the data going to serve the validation of that?
I've found that there are people who absolutely want to engage with you early on that, and there are people who won't. And in my field at the moment of strategic workforce planning, it's sometimes a hard sell, and it's similar with employee experience and the benefits of that. What's worked well for me in both of those areas is to just have built really solid relationships. In my view, HR are the business, that they're not separate from it. Secondly, share stories, use cases, case studies. I ended up working for a senior partner in a consultancy firm who genuinely spent 80% of his time supporting those who who reported to him. And it was incredible. He would find you something that you needed at the right time to support you to be the best that you could be. He developed you. And he spent 20% on his own, big targets he had to meet. But we were winning gold medals in all sorts of consultancy awards. We were winning loads of clients. The vibe was really great and positive. But people don't get it unless they've kind of experienced it. But to hear those stories allows you to almost trust that you perhaps could try that as a business leader. And the third and final thing I'd say is just, certainly from a SWP perspective, lead with insight. We found this from data. We have identified this, and the so what's for you, the risks for you, the opportunities you might want to get after are this, that, and the other. How can I support you in this? And then you suddenly have their attention. So that's worked for me in the past.
Sorry, go ahead, Charmaine.
Thanks. I was going to echo what Chris said because I've had similar experiences. And I think one of the things we forget as humans in general, especially when we're in the business context, is we have to answer the WIFM for everyone. What's in it for me? And when we can answer that, people are more likely to be a lot more engaged in whatever it is that we're being presented for them, because everyone wants to understand what's the benefit. And that's just how we're wired as humans. So if we can hack the human wiring process, right? Because we have the answer to that and answer that question, I've found that people are likely to be more engaged. I've also dispelled the myth at organizations that it's an HR thing, because it's not, right? How do we get employees engaged? I've gone to employees to say, what are the questions that we should be asking that we're not? The other thing we don't often consider is, and I'm always going to bring up, is the cultural context and how all of our identities shape the way we receive the world and vice versa. But I've also, for myself, invalidated a lot of data. For example, if I work for a company that, is, and I've always worked with global companies, sometimes we take the survey and then we translate that to other languages. And then the problem becomes is that words have different meanings. Right. So, for example, a question like, are you happy? Happy it's relative. Right. And how I might interpret that based on my personal experiences may not be. So a lot of times I think these surveys don't make sense because there's no real way, unless you're going to define what you mean. And I have rarely seen that, where someone could hover over a word or understand more what the intention behind the question was to answer it. So I personally feel like a lot of time gets wasted because all this effort goes into building this thing that is not really defined and doesn't consider people's cognitive styles, their personal experiences, and how that may shape it. But I do think that one way that I've seen helpful is not just getting other business stakeholders involved, but getting employees involved in the development of that. What do we ask you that makes no sense? And one of the things that came about from that was employees saying, hey, from a cultural context perspective, I don't get what this means. So what that said to me at that organization was, oh, not only are we not presenting the right questions, we don't even know if the data we're getting back is valid based on the interpretation that each person is coming up with. So all of it connects, and there's a huge opportunity there, but everyone should be involved. And I think getting employees involved is something we miss a lot.
That's such a good point, Charmaine. It's making me think about every survey and every question I've ever done. Because if people aren't answering it in the same mindset and the same experience and the same kind of situation, then the data is going to be completely different. And Meredith, you were mentioning getting managers and leaders engaged early on, and waiting till you have the data is too late. And I completely agree. I think they need to be bought in before you start. They need to be bought in, and the development of the questions and the strategy, what we want to measure and why it's important, not just from a preparation in the back end when we have the data and what are we going to do with it, but even through that process of responding to the survey. Managers are the ones that are going to be advocating for all of our HR programs. They need to be bought into everything that we do, because I agree, it's a collective. We're not in isolation. We're not a silo. We work with and for everybody. And that mindset has to be there, especially within surveys. And then with that buy-in at the beginning of that process, I think and hope what happens at the end is the leaders that are bought in, there's almost a shared accountability of, okay, now how do we handle this? What do we do about this? A lot of the things that come through the survey aren't engagement, they're not HR, they're also business issues that the company has to solve as a whole. And we all have that responsibility for solving them.
What an amazing conversation this is. I want to move us a little bit off of engagement surveys. I think the conversation's been so rich. And everybody on the panel has touched on areas outside of the survey. So let's talk about actually engaging employees with whatever data we have, whether it's retention, turnover, whether it's engagement surveys, whether it's performance reviews, whether it's focus groups we've had. What do you do with all of the data? How do you bring the people into the people process?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I was going to say, the first thing I like to do is, as a CHRO, in all of my CHRO roles, I kind of consider, the CHRO CEO relationship to be quite sacred and a very special one. So the first step that I like to take is, outside of the HR team, sharing the results first with the CEO. Here's what we're seeing, here's what we're hearing, and giving them a day or two to just sort of digest and process. Because to Heather's point, there's a lot of feedback in these surveys and exit interviews and stay interviews that is not simply just related to people topics. A lot of it could be business topics as well. Once the CEO has had some time to process and digest this information, from there, I would typically share it with the entire leadership team, with some of my team's insights and recommendations around what we should do next. I like for the leadership team to play a role in action planning. So they need to, if we tell them what to do, that's a sure shot way of having them perpetuate this notion of this is HR is going to do it, HR is going to take care of it. But at the same time, I think it's helpful for HR to come to the table and say, this is what we've learned. This is what we think we should do. What do you think? And what else are we missing? So making them part of the conversation, but not putting the whole thing on them, because often they are not equipped, and even at senior levels, not trained to understand what do we do with this information and this data. It can be quite overwhelming for them. And then once you have an agreed upon action plan that is a company-wide action plan, I think it's important to take it one step further and personalize it based on function or region, however your company is sort of organized, and sitting down with those leaders and talking to them about what are their team's specific challenges. Because you may have something that's a company-wide challenge that may translate to your marketing department, but it may not. That team may have a completely different set of challenges. Maybe they just brought in 20 new people and they're struggling to onboard everyone. So I think personalizing it is the next step, and helping leaders develop their team-specific action plans. And then the third thing I would say is, when you do start to implement measures and actions based on the feedback that you've learned, tying it back to the feedback that you heard. So years ago, I was in a CHRO role where we were about to roll out a parental leave policy. And we did a survey and we received feedback that the employees wanted a parental leave policy. And so I said, great, when we roll this out, let's remind our employees, hey, you gave us feedback that you wanted parental leave benefits. Here we are. We heard you. We're doing something about it. And the person on my team who was working on this policy said, yes, Malvika, but we were already going to do it. We were working on it anyway. And I said, yes, of course we were, but didn't the employee feedback confirm that we're on the right path? So why not give the employees the credit, right? And why not tie our action back to the feedback that they gave us? Because one, it makes them feel heard and understood. And two, it's going to make them much more likely to give us candid feedback in the future if they see that we are taking action based on what they've told us. So that's what I would do.
So let's talk about the actively disengaged employees. We have sort of a spectrum of the actively engaged, the people who show up to your office 3 times a week and they're like, I have an idea. And they're like willing to be in and willing to do it, all the way to the middle of the spectrum of people who just come to work and want to come to work and go home, and the far end of the spectrum of the actively disengaged. If we're connecting the dots for our leadership between employee experience and people in business success, how do we get at those actively disengaged folks and either engage them or help them figure out what they want to be doing instead?
I think this is a really interesting and tough topic. I've read a few studies that argue that you want to focus on the engaged and the middle group that potentially could become engaged through positive programs, communication, etc. And then the bottom group either will become engaged or they're going to drop off naturally. So that's one kind of school of thought. Another opportunity, which I think someone mentioned in the comments, and this is one that I do very often when you talk to those people, if you're lucky enough to, that are disengaged and have those problems and challenges within the organization, it's okay, let's fix it. What's your idea? You're the expert in this area. This is impacting you. What's your solution? And if you're in an organization that allows for it, giving them that side project about, okay, let's fix it. Guess whose project this is to solve the solution? It's yours. And what I've done with employees in the past is call them more frequently and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing. How does that land with you? And so pulling them in from a solution perspective, I find sometimes helps, but it can be tough because sometimes they're too far gone. So.
I love this question too, and it was something I was thinking about earlier, but within a different context. I wanted to share it because I think this is important. You know, according to WHO, disappeared for a second. Yeah, it went out for a second for me. So, you know, according to WHO, you know, it said something like 12 billion working days are lost every year due to like depression and anxiety. And, you know, that's $1 trillion US a year. So I also think the piece that we haven't talked about in terms of the engagement and whether that's absenteeism that results or presenteeism, you know, being at the job and just not actually being there, you're physically there, but nothing else, is, you know, the mental health impact that people are suffering just in general, but more importantly, when an environment isn't centering the employee experience, right? And that's something where HR folks, we're not mental health practitioners. So, and I get very, very concerned when HR people try to lean in that way, because it's not what, even if you are an expert, you're likely not at the company in that capacity. So I think it's important to recognize that the impact that people are having, right? So sometimes we focus on, oh, this person is not engaged. Is there something else more going on? And do we need to do a warm handoff, right? It's not HR's role. You know, at what point do we say, who's the expert that might need to be involved here to kind of figure out what might be going on? Because sometimes disengagement could be attributed to the work environment, right? Because if people are working right now, over 60% of the world population is working. If people are working and their environments are not healthy, that is impacting their mental health and it is impacting their health. And that's something that we have to consider. So yes, we can work to fix the environment, but is this engagement or lack of engagement a result of the environment or something else going on? And I do think that sometimes we need to double and triple click into that, because I've seen companies move to action really quickly. You know, there's one person I'm thinking about whose parent was dying from cancer. And they didn't share that with everyone, but they were being labeled by some others as, oh, they're disengaged, we need to get rid of them. Well, double clicking into that person's experience and recognizing that they were themselves in crisis meant that we were able to go a different direction. That person is now CEO of a thriving company that they founded, but they were just going through a hard stage in life. And I think that's an important part of the conversation, that when we're talking about engagement and disengagement and how to get people more engaged, that we have to consider that too. Sometimes it is not 1 + 1 = 2.
I've often thought that there needs to be greater levels of compassion at work. In my first career in the military, there was a strong values-based culture, and there was actually a lot of compassion between people, leaders, and their teams in that space that actually in the business environment you definitely see less of. You might have little pockets of that, but actually really understanding those who you're working with or for, or who you have the privilege to lead at work, is something that we don't always get right in businesses. And so helping people to in a way hold the mirror up. Lauren, you'll know this as a coach, I'm a coach, holding the mirror up to see the impact of themselves as managers, but also the disengaged cohort a little bit as well. I'm with you, Heather, that you kind of have to place your effort where it's going to create the most value. You don't want to spend 80% of your time on the disengaged to not get much return from it. So I guess if you've got people in critical roles where you really do need for that to turn around, then yes, do that. But for me, I think that there is a journey that people can go on to become much more engaged than what they are. And that all for me stems from good leadership. We talk about leadership, don't we, as the top. It's not, it's everybody. Everybody brings their own leads themselves in the workplace. And so how do we bring that more compassionate way of working and putting people as well as money into the drivers? It is what I spend a lot of my time speaking to business leaders about, not just as an HR practitioner, but as a business leader as well, leading by example.
I think it's also important to understand what is it that your disengaged or highly disengaged employees are looking for. I find that often as humans, one of our basic needs is just to be heard and understood. People just want to feel seen and heard. Often they don't even necessarily need you to do something. They just want to know that someone understands and listens to our concerns. I was in a company once where we had a small customer service team, very small team, 5 or 6 people, and they had just lost their direct leader. And this team became highly disengaged. Pretty much overnight, our customer satisfaction plummeted. They were missing key KPIs that they had crushed for years and years. And when I sat down with them, along with a member of my team, they just wanted their concerns to be heard. They felt like the leader who left was always looking out for them and kind of had their back. And they didn't really trust the leadership in the organization, the higher ups. So they felt like, bless you, they felt like they lost the one person who cared about them and looked after them. And so they just wanted to be heard, and they wanted their concerns to be known, because they wanted us to know, whoever you replace, we need that person to play a similar role and look out for us. And that's it. That's all they wanted. They just wanted someone to sit down with them and listen to them and make them feel heard. So I think it's important to understand, what is it that your disengaged employees are looking for. I completely agree with Heather's kind of point of view. I've used a very similar playbook, in that you focus on the actively engaged people and sort of use them as champions to convert those who are on the fence. But sometimes, when you look at your disengaged people, just having a conversation with them might solve a lot.
Absolutely. A great point. and look to those leaders who are in your organization who are great at engaging their employees, and recruit them to help you with your engagement strategies. So we're already at the end of our conversation, which went very fast. But let's just, in 30 seconds or so, if each of you could just go around the room and give us an insight about something we didn't get to today, but is a good place to look if you're inside an organization or working with an organization and trying to really help them improve their engagement.
Yeah, Malvika just touched on something incredibly important, and that's that we've talked about HR's role, we've talked about the employee's role, we've talked about executive leadership role, but the people who are hearing most about engagement and managing engagement most are those direct managers and those direct leaders. And so an investment in not only getting buy-in from them, that engagement equals results, but empowering them with ways to really take that to their teams and be that kind of leader. Super important.
I think in closing, it's always really important to find out what matters to your employee base. I think Malvika mentioned earlier about rolling out a parental leave policy and validating that from employees. And it's not going to do you any use to roll out great programs or policies if it doesn't resonate with the employees. So you have to find out what's important to people and what's going to have an impact and what they need and want. And that's going to, I think, drive a lot of the direction of engagement and experience that we're implementing.
Yeah, and I think I would double down on the importance of listening rather than engaging, which seems to be more active communicating out. If we're going to really understand what people want and what matters, we need to show that we're listening. And you're so right. I think it was Meredith just mentioned that the first level line manager or first level leadership. How are we listening to them as a cohort, because they're the ones hearing from the coalface? How are we actually reflecting on what we're hearing as an organization? What's the absorptive capacity to be able to then change what we do based on what we're hearing? And then clearly part of that is to feed back to people that not only have we heard, we're doing something about it. So there's a continuous cycle of listening and learning and engaging that we sometimes just replace with engagement or comms out.
I think that's a key point. What it means to be a leader today or a good leader today is drastically different from what it meant to be a good leader a decade ago, or even 4 years ago at the start of the pandemic. People's fundamental expectations of work and the workplace have changed. They want to be able to bring their whole selves to work. They want their managers to support them and be empathetic. And so the leader role has become increasingly complex, and our leaders are not equipped to deal with this new to world challenge and lead in this new hybrid, complex post-pandemic world we find ourselves in. So I would say focus on leaders as the key driver of the employee experience and invest in their growth and development as well.
Yeah, I love that. I was going to say, get clear on the why and then communicate that. A lot of times we're just doing these things and there's no real reason that we can point to of why it matters, and the inability to communicate that. And then the bigger thing that just was shared that I was thinking of too is train the trainer. So the managers, the leaders are essentially the trainers, right? Because we're going to need them to go forward and execute on the shifts that we are requesting, or to pay more attention and listen more. And they're not trained a lot of times, right? And we're human, so they get that feedback, they may personalize it. So how do we train them to engage differently so that they can start demonstrating the behaviors and showing up in ways that they're more confident in their ability to lead through whatever that insight might be?
Thank you so much, everybody. Panelists, thank you for sharing your brilliance. Those who are listening in, you gave some great comments, and we so appreciate you being here. Make sure to connect with the panelists on LinkedIn so you can see what they're up to and they can see what you're up to, and keep joining these panels. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks all.